You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 7 of the Prepared Warrior. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Mike Farrell. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Blackjack Pershing, who said, "If you know how to shoot and are quite ready to shoot, the chances are that you won't have to shoot." Excited to welcome our guest to the program. Mike Farrell is the president of Smart Firearms Training Devices. He is also a seasoned entrepreneur as well as a professional airline pilot. After taking up shooting, Mike found his new passion. Mike enjoyed shooting so much that he eventually became a firearms instructor. And Mike founded Smart Firearms after being dismayed at the poor quality of training guns available. After making his first sale in 2013, Smart Firearms has grown rapidly, more than doubling sales every year. Smart Firearms Training Guns are now found in some of the finest agencies, academies, and companies across the country and the world. Mike has also been a volunteer sworn law enforcement officer since 2005, along with still being a firearms instructor. Thanks so much for coming, Mike.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
This is great. Yeah, so I was wondering, I guess first, what was your first exposure to firearms like, and how did that lead to where you are now?
Sure. My first exposure to firearms was when I was receiving training. What I noticed was the quality of instruction from the instructors was fantastic. I couldn't have hoped for better people to teach me to shoot. However, the quality of the instructors was not backed up by the quality of the training equipment available. We were basically using plastic toy guns in order to do a lot of the scenario-based training, and outside of that, you would go straight to the range and use a live weapon. So there was a real big gap between basically this is the gun, this is how it fits in a holster, and how you employ that weapon on the range, which is a very controlled environment. I felt there was a very large gap in which there was an absolute need for better training equipment.
Okay, so like what kind of errors would you see most frequently even as you became a firearms instructor?
Sure. There's a lot of errors that get made. One is from the time you or I were 5 years old and we looked at our first movie poster and we saw our heroes, James Bond, Jason Bourne, you name it, where do they have their finger all the time? And it's right on the trigger, ready to go. Unfortunately, that's naturally where we want to go with our finger because we want to be ready to go. Unfortunately, with a live weapon, it's absolutely the worst place for our finger to be. It should be indexed along the side of the weapon until the decision is made to employ that weapon against the target. So some of the biggest mistakes made are having the finger move into the guard as the weapon is coming up on target. So as early as when it's clearing the holster, which causes the shooter themselves to possibly get an accidental discharge right down the leg, which puts them immediately out of any fight that they were about to be in.
Yes.
Also, as they transition between targets, leaving their finger in the guard, crossing teammates and no-shoot targets with the finger in the guard. So if they were to take a round, while they are transitioning, that round would go into one of their teammates. And now not one, but two people are out of that fight on your side. The other mistake that's not commonly known is the reholster. As you go to reholster the weapon, mechanically, everything is working against you. If that finger is sitting there inside the guard and you go to put it down in another holster, you're going to get an accidental discharge right down the leg. And it's probably the most common form of accident in law enforcement. So luckily not normally fatal because big city police departments, you're 5 minutes away from the best medical care money can buy. You're with your teammates. So that normally is not a fatal incident. However, it's a very common incident, and it's one that I thought should be easy to fix. So that's what I saw.
Right, and I imagine that depending how you get hit down the leg that could be permanently or
absolutely, absolutely,
disability for a long time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's ended more than a few careers, and and not to put everything in terms of dollars and cents, but big police departments, every time they have an accidental discharge, departments have told me that it's between $50,000 and $120,000 just to do the investigation. That's before you pay the first dollar of disability, and that's if the round goes into the dirt. It does not go into a person, even a person woefully deserving of a round. So it's a big money issue at the departments.
So now you have this company, Smart Firearms, and you noticed these issues. So how did you kind of go about trying to fix those training issues?
Sure. I talked to the very best instructors I knew, and I asked them where are our issues coming from, and they were pretty united in their response that we do something different in the mat room, so to speak, where we're teaching people how to fight, how to defend themselves, how to draw the weapon, and what we do on the range, which one is this free-for-all environment where nothing matters because we're using plastic guns, and then we go to the range where everything matters because we're using live guns, and it's extremely controlled. So one is this consequence-free environment where we're very aggressive, and the other one is where we're very non-aggressive, which is good. I mean, I want the range to be a controlled environment. You do not want to injure your people in training. However, due to this big disconnect, they were saying the plastic training guns don't give enough feedback to new shooters to really get rid of the bad habits. So I actually came up with the idea, and I bounced it off of these instructors. What if we would have put a sensor suite into the trigger guard based on different algorithms? And at the time, I didn't know enough to really say this is the algorithm. I mean, as just a point of context, when we started Smart Firearms, that sensor suite had 4 different algorithms built into a total. It now has over 120 because of inputs from the departments. This works, this doesn't work, we need this, we don't need that. And the one thing that we've tried to do is listen to the departments, is that we recognize while we have tactical people in the company, we have Arno, firearms instructor, New York State Police, 30 years. While we have all these people, what we've decided is we listen to the people who do it every day, and we try to answer their needs without trying too much to guess their needs. We try to listen to them and just fill the need instead of talking them into something that they may or may not want. And they're type A anyway, so you're not going to talk them into anything. So with that being said, so that was it. The sensor suite I developed at first, and we had 1 or 2 departments buy them. And they hated it. Oh, yeah. But they liked us enough to tell us why they hated it, okay? Yeah. And then we built basically a second version of the first gun, and they said, well, that solved our problem. And it was good enough for those couple of departments that used it. And what they were nice enough to do is tell us how to make a Gentoo. And then we made a Gentoo based on all the improvements these 2 or 3 departments told us that they needed to make the gun useful in their hands. And we made the Gentoo, and within a month or so of making the Gentoo, we got it into service with those 3 departments that told us what to do, and through their word of mouth, not any good salesmanship on my part or anything, we were getting calls from NYPD. After that, Boston PD, New York State Police, and we were starting to get these big departments calling us. And it wasn't because we were great salesmen. It was because those original departments that we went into service with, they're on speed dial with each other, good, bad, or indifferent. Right. If they don't like something, they're not shy about picking up the phone. And if they like something, they're not shy about picking up the phone. So, and luckily the Gentoo was a runaway success. With the defensive tactics instructors, not the firearms instructors. So for a few different reasons, because we were solving the defensive tactics instructor's problem. So with that being said, we took additional feedback, and now we're on the Gen 4, about to move into the Gen 6. Wow. And constantly just trying to answer what the different departments want, and while retaining what we've already made the changes for to keep our current customers happy, operators happy.
So it's spread by word of mouth for the most part, just because it was working for the people who were using it.
Exactly.
And is that something that happens frequently with police training kind of devices or tactics where they're looking for something to fill a need, or do you think there was issues at the time with that specifically firearm safety, or it just they?
Well, yeah, sure. There's always issues that drive needs, so to speak, and if there's a high-profile firearms accident, that may drive that department to say, hey, you know what? Not next year, not 2 years from now, but we're going to solve something this month. And that frees. There's never, unfortunately, and this does not just go for police departments. This goes for you and I in our own lives. There's very little money for prevention, but there's a ton of money in cures. All right, and so we don't necessarily plan well to prevent problems. But once a problem occurs, we're very good at making sure it doesn't happen again. So, with that being said, I would say word of mouth was a big driver, but at individual departments, a lot of times it would be, unfortunately, an accident that would make our phone ring. Hey, can you fix this kind of problem? And a lot of times, the answer is not that specific problem. I mean, I'm very honest with what I tell departments if they call us, and I will say this. Really, the big we are a tool that help these departments avoid accidents, but really what prevent accidents and what make better shooters at the department, and why U.S. and Canadian police departments have such a good record of firearm safety is because of what incredible instructors they have. So if they buy us, we're not necessarily fixing a problem overnight.
Right.
We're really just enabling good instructors to help fix a problem that might be out there on the street. The fact is, without the instructors doing what they do, our device would be useless.
So when you talked about the device and how there's a sensor and there's a number of algorithms, what can you explain sort of how those algorithms work?
Absolutely.
Or what they do?
Absolutely. So basically, when we first came out with the training gun, I just figured out, pick a number in your head. Are we going to give them 1 second to get to the trigger before the alarm goes off? Is it 2 seconds? Name a number, and I forget what we even came up with now at the time, but let's just say it was a second. Well, then I learned from talking to the instructors, hey, you know what? That might be fine for that first shot, but we want that student to be able to stage his second, third, and fourth shot. And those are not really where we find a problem with accidents. So we want to buy that student more time. So we had to go back in and build more time into the subsequent shots, or if the student is what's called staging the trigger. If he's coming up on the trigger and just taking it 1/8 of a second more before he squeezes off, you want to give him that room to do that time-wise. So these are all things we built in, and not all of them worked out. Like sometimes police departments say, hey, we think we need this, and once you build it, they say it's actually not doing what we thought it would do. And I think part of our success has been the willingness to fail. Is the willingness to try and fail, and to make agreements with departments to try beta, hey, let's send you 2 guns with this built into it and just see how it works.
Right.
Do you hate it? Do you love it? So that's basically, a lot of the algorithms are built around timing, and it gets down to the milliseconds, and if you could believe it. Like you and I, if we would be out shooting, if you're a fast shooter and I'm a slow shooter, the difference between us, time on the trigger, is actually not very much. Right. So in order to not alarm a slow, deliberate shooter while catching someone who's on his way to an accident, is very little. So you're defining things in milliseconds sometimes, and not even quarters of a second or 16th of a second. We used to divide things up into quarters of seconds, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is way too detailed, so to speak. There's a quarters of a second no one's going to even realize. And when you're really looking at a trigger pull, a quarter of a second is an eternity, so to speak, between what a slow, deliberate shooter is doing and what someone who's just lingering in the guard is doing, in the trigger guard. So, yeah, that's the algorithms, basically. There's more to it than that. As far as we have visual alarms that talk to the instructors, all those type of things that are going on. But to answer your question, it's mostly based on time.
And so what are the Smart Firearms made out of?
Yeah. Made out of high-impact plastic, because what we want the departments to be able to do is treat them exactly like their defensive tactics weapons. Throw them down a flight of stairs, run them over with a Crown Victoria. Whatever they were doing with their blue guns, we want them to be able to do with ours. So really beat them up in the mat room and not have them break. So high-impact ABS is what they're made out of. There's other parts of the gun that are made out of nylon plastics, and there's some metal built into the gun just to give it some weight.
Right.
So inside the magazine, inside the nose of the weapon, and then we have an electronics bay that's basically just a circuit board, some springs for the trigger, and speakers and all that. But basically, if you looked at the bulk of the weapon, it's high-impact ABS.
And so why is it important for law enforcement to train with replica weapons?
Sure, and it's not necessarily so for those departments out there, the training with conversion kits and live weapons that they've just made safe for these scenarios. That's fine too. Okay, there's places for all of them.
Right.
The sim guns are fantastic. I mean, you almost cannot replace the pain inoculation that goes from being hit by a sim round and being able to continue on with that fight. We don't replicate that. So that's not the market we're in, yet I love that market, okay? I think that they do a fantastic job. Replica weapons are great in the non-active shooter scenario, so to speak, where I'm looking at you, like a lot of what we're doing, even in this podcast, okay? We take a lot of cues off each other, right? Like facial, hands, everything. And when we're both buttoned up in protective gear, we lose a lot of that. So we lose a lot of those pre-attack cues. Is he interested in me? Is he interested in something else? What is the focus of the conversation going on? And for police officers who are training, vehicle stops, suspicious persons, all that sort of stuff, a lot of it's driven by what's going on. It's not the black and white of an active shooter, someone firing away with an AK-47 in the middle of a library. That's pretty cut and dry. You have to engage that person and put them down, right? Yep. So a lot of what they train for is not that. It's which way is this going? And if we're both buried under protective gear, we're not seeing all of that. So we have to actually exaggerate what we're doing as role players, right, to make that person know what we're about to do. And that's not how life works. A lot of it's very subtle. And a lot of it is not things we control, so it's the things that, that are just happening in our subconscious that we learn to read over time in our lives. So, and the other reason why replica guns are great is that, unfortunately, live ammunition has a bad habit of finding its way into sterile events. So where everyone is de-gunned, there's no live ammunition coming into this event, it's all in the gun lockers outside. Well, 3-4 times a year, a police officer gets shot, a role player gets shot by a live weapon that somehow made it into the event. Just happened down in Punta Gorda, Florida, where a role player was shot in the chest by a Citizens Police Academy by an officer who thought he had a sim gun in his hand. Replicas make life easy for your instructors because they can look a mile away and know it's a simulator gun. It's not do I have to look closer to see if it's a live weapon or not? No, it's an orange gun. So that's why I like those guns. Police departments choose them in different colors. Some get black, some get blue, just due to whatever they want. But I think we have a definite place in the equation where there's a lot of decision making, a lot of ambiguity, where sim guns are far better than a live weapon.
Sure. So replica weapons that fire are for situations where you want to have to, you're going to use them to fire
That's right.
a lot more. Whereas yours, there's the minutia of interactions with people where you may just have your hand on your gun and not quite know. So
Absolutely.
There's so many different, I guess, situations. That's what you're saying that police deal with. That there's so many. While there are so many different training kind of tools, there's so many different situations they relate to.
Absolutely. And if you look at it, like if you and I went over to an academy today and they were doing scenario-based training, they're doing mat room work, you may divide it up. Let's just say 50% end up in no shoots and 50% end up in shoots. The reality of a police officer's life is 99.999% of his interactions end up in no shoots. The vast majority, thank goodness, end up in no shoots. So I believe most training should be geared toward, a shooting should be the unexpected event, not the expected event. And if training reinforces that, you get pretty much the right responses out of it, the startle reflexes and all that sort of stuff that you don't get if almost every scenario ends up in a shooting.
So a lot of people are using your tools now. What kind of responses do you get? And I know you say people will tell you, maybe they'll suggest things you can change or this and that. But what kind of overall response do you get from people who use Smart Firearms?
Yeah, I from the instructors, we have received a universal response that they believe that we are improving the quality of their firearms training, improving the quality of their recruit training if that's what they use it for, and that we are lowering their accidental discharge rates. So that would be the universal response. Overall, very positive. And what I feel is the feedback we're getting on improvements shows me we're doing it right. And what I mean by that is we're getting very small suggestions like, wow, if the speaker could just be a little bit louder, it'd be great. And the fact that we're getting that, I love, because it shows me that the big stuff is the sensor suite working right, does the magazine release right, is the trigger feel right. All of those things, when we're not hearing that anymore, it tells me that we're doing a really good job on our improvement schedule. And while we try to be disciplined with our improvements, that I try to make sure that is kind of a consensus that we're getting from the departments, and I check with other departments when I hear something. What do you think? And if it's a consensus, we go ahead with it and we make a change. But I try to be a little disciplined about when and why we do things.
So speaking of innovations, what kind of things are new for coming from Smart Firearms?
Sure. We have now our SF-25 training weapon. We have just modified so it will fit both the M&P holster and the SIG 320 holster, which is, and soon it will also fit the H&K USP holster. And the reason that is great, a lot of sheriff's departments, a lot of big PDs, they have one gun they're issued, and everyone that comes in the door has a holster for that gun. And once they de-gun at the gun locker and they re-gun with the replica weapons, they're all set. So they don't need multiple holster fits. But a lot of sheriff's departments that allow for different weapons, a lot of neighboring departments coming in training, they need these to fit different holsters. So we've modified the weapon to work with that. And it may seem like a small thing, but it's a massive improvement for a lot of these sheriff's departments that don't need to carry extra inventory for a bunch of different weapons that may never come through the door.
Right.
Our next improvement, we're coming out with an M4. Training weapon that will be used for both simulators and scenario-based training. So, which will have our sensor suite in it, and we believe it will bring a new level of realism to scenario-based training that hasn't been there before.
What kind of challenges do you have developing like such a different weapon like that?
The biggest thing is trying to really integrate the lessons learned from the previous projects, the previous weapons, and figuring out what's the same and what's different.
Yeah.
And sometimes trying to recognize when something's different to let go of things that you had to do in the pistols to say, you know what, this is a new challenge and new opportunities. So we're going to do these new things in the M4 where we always try to carry things over. I think emotionally you want to carry things over that you've spent a lot of time perfecting, like the trigger system. We finally got it now that it works so well in the pistols. We have with 5.5 pound pull, we have a good reset. And when we went to the M4 with the capability of going full auto, that no longer was adequate. So we had to go to a spring-based system mechanically spring-based system that we didn't use before. And emotionally, that was tough to let go of. We spent so much time getting this pistol trigger just right, and now we have to go with a new solution for the M4. Those type of things are tough. But really, it's a matter of laying out the requirements from the get-go and not allowing too much mission creep. And that's, if you're a passionate person and you want to have the very best thing out there, you're very susceptible to mission creep. It's like, wow, I want that, I want this. When the reality is you have to base it on what reality is in front of you. So I would say that's our biggest challenge.
Now, you're also an airline pilot. What do you think about pilots being armed? How do you think that would be? Is that a useful thing, do you think? Or
I could just answer it generically, just what I know of it in the United States. They do it in the United States. That's public information. And, I think it's a good deterrent, I would guess. And it's an additional layer, of safety, causes probably logistical problems for anyone that was planning an attack. But yeah, so generically, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea as long as those pilots are properly trained and vetted. I think that is it's a fantastic idea, and I think it's situational because it works for the United States. Would it work for Canada? It's just something for each country to decide what their risk rewards are, I would think. And but in the United States, it seems like it's worked out okay.
I guess I just have one more question for you, Mike.
Sure.
Just in general, what do you think is the most important thing for firearms instructors who are training law enforcement to know, about training people to be safe in the future?
Sure. One is when you are training people, some people they think they're giving people more bang for their buck if they make things tough. I would disagree with that. I would say you're giving people most bang for their buck if you make it relatable. If you make it something they can carry forward with, use in the field, and don't bog them down with 55 different techniques. Basically, just give them relatable training that they can tap into when they're under stress. Because when we're under stress, one thing I have learned as a pilot is a lot of your fine motor functions, they're not really there for you when you're under stress. It's down to gross motor. And so if you have fine motor skills that are there, that are part of your stay alive strategy, they probably shouldn't be there. So a lot of things that look really cool, magazine change outs that, the YouTube stars seem to love that have two magazines in your hand and you're rotating it around, one out, one in. I feel the reality of life means you'll end up with two magazines on the ground and nothing in the gun. Where, if you just did things that depended on gross motor, then you'd be better off. And a lot of times that's slower. And life's imperfect. And you have to acknowledge that the people that you're training are not going to have the time to be as good at this as you are. So if you're training, if you have 2 weeks to train people, you have to acknowledge the fact that none of them, just accept some of them will be back every day at the range. That's your outliers. The rest of them will go on with their lives. And they'll go back and they'll requal in 6 months. And that'll be their first time back on the range. And 6 months after that, that'll be the next time on the range. So you have to teach them things in a way that they can retain it. And that would be my only thoughts going forward. And as far as, I'm no guru on firearms instruction. I just know what I hear from the guys who are. And and what I see out in the field. And I would say that, make it relatable and make your training something that they can retain when they're under stress, which means any of the fine motor stuff, get it out of your training curriculum completely. It looks cool, but it's not. Right. It doesn't help them.
That sounds like great advice, keeping it simple and usable in real life. Thanks so much, Mike, for coming on the program, and good luck in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.